This is the Book of Mormon Digging Deeper. I'm your host, Mark Swint. I'm not often at a loss for words, but it has happened. A few years ago, I was giving a fireside about my then recently published book, Compare Isaiah, Understanding Biblical Scriptures in the Book of Mormon, when one of the guests asked me a question after the presentation that caught me completely off guard. He asked, "Do we know more about the Book of Mormon than Joseph Smith did?" I had to stop and think hard about that one for a moment, and finally I responded, "Yes, I think we do." Afterwards, I thought longer and harder about the answer I had given. It felt wrong, but it also felt correct. Over time, I became more and more convinced that my answer had been the right one. Let me explain why. Years ago, I wrote and maintained a blog when blogs were the way before podcasts. It was called Science and Religion, and the purpose of it was to explore whether or not there was any common ground between claims of the Bible and the prevailing scientific understanding. You see, without getting too far off track here, let me tell you what motivated me. I love the scriptures, but I also love science, particularly physics. But all of the sciences, really. It is my very strongly held belief that God is all-powerful, not because he is not bound by any laws, as is the prevailing doctrines of modern religion, but rather because he understands and can control and use all of the laws of the universe. You see, in our world, every time we learn something new in science, it gives us more ability to do something we couldn't do before. Understanding the laws of aerodynamics gave us the power of flight, something with which birds had taunted us for 1,000 years. When we came to understand electromagnetism, we were able to light up the world and mechanize tasks that for millennia had required exhausting manual labor. When we discovered lasers, that opened a whole world of capabilities that we had never even dreamed of. You see, knowledge gives power, and for Heavenly Father, all knowledge means all power. So, back to the point. I maintained that science and religion were not necessarily diametrically opposed. Oh, for sure, bad science and bad religion were definitely opposed, but pure doctrine and pure science were ultimately the same thing. The conflict between the two arose only after, primarily, the council at Nicaea in 325 AD, where Constantine had called together all of the religious leaders around the Mediterranean and convened a council where they needed to come up with one universal doctrine. That doctrine, once established, was declared infallible, meaning nothing was wrong with it and it could not be changed. Now, I'm not here to pick on the Catholic Church at all, so let's just say that a rift developed between men of learning and men of the cloth. Sadly, there never should have been any disputing in the first place. Science and religion occupied and occupy now two different places in the spectrum of knowledge. The problem arose because in the scriptures, the Lord never needed to explain himself to his prophets. He gave revelations, visions, and commands without the need to give an explanation of how or why he was doing so. Moses, for example, was an observer only. The Lord showed him a vision of the entire world from beginning to end. and the creation of the world was recorded in Genesis. But the Lord never told him how the things he saw happening were being brought to pass. I call this kind of knowledge exoteric knowledge, the what without the why. Moses saw what happened. He saw the earth in the beginning covered with water. Then he saw the waters gather together and the dry land appear. He wrote that down. He did not know why the waters gathered together or how they gathered together, only that they did. It was left to science to give the why and the how that happened. And scientists struggled with that question for centuries, but finally, during my lifetime, came up with the theory of plate tectonics, and suddenly Moses' story had credibility. In a nutshell, prophets give us the what, as in, what do we do? What is going to happen? What will be expected? What will be the consequences? They never give us the why nor the how. That is left to the natural philosophers and scientists to figure out. All of the prophets of the Bible were observers only, without ever needing to explain the why and how of what they saw. So, getting back to the question about whether or not we know more than Joseph Smith did about the Book of Mormon, of course we do. We have had 200 years to study the words, search out the clues, explore the lands, and uncover the evidence for the things we read in its pages. We better know more than Joseph did. His job was to translate. The information was as new and exciting and, dare I say, enigmatic to him as he translated as it was for us the first, second, or even third time we read the Book of Mormon. In fact, have you ever read anew something in the book that you would swear had not been in there the last time you read it? This is as it should be. The scriptures are, I believe, designed to deliver a message to the reader at whatever level of understanding that reader has. As one grows in the gospel, they are able to glean more and more meaning from the same scriptures that they had previously read. This is in keeping with the notion of learning line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little. The same was true for the early leaders of the church. They read, they studied, they formed the school of the prophets, the very purpose of which was to try to understand this incredible book of wonders that they held in their hands. And it was not a one-and-done reading, but continued study and pondering. I believe even Joseph, though he was intimately familiar with the words he had translated, still had much to learn over the years as he and the church grew to know the Book of Mormon ever better. Now remember how Isaiah says, "And the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I am not learned." Joseph's job wasn't to explain the Book of Mormon. It was to translate it. And he did so at great personal expense and danger. It is left to all of us, prophets and apostles included, to study, dissect, research, and ponder these things within its pages. And so it is to be expected that there are hidden treasures and gems, things not readily obvious, residing within its pages. And oh, how fun it is to dig them out. Well, let me get on with today's subject and podcast. It is about something that has remained undiscovered until just very recently. By way of introduction, though, let me tell you about something interesting that occurred at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis. President Nelson called upon all the members of the church worldwide, and for that matter, he invited everybody in the world who would participate to fast on Good Friday, April 10th. For those who aren't sure, Good Friday is the day that we remember as the actual day of the crucifixion of the Lord. He died on a Friday and rose again on Sunday. That's Easter Sunday. What some may not realize is that Good Friday marks the beginning of the Jewish observance of the Passover. The Passover is either a 7-day or an 8-day observance, depending upon which branch of Judaism is practiced. So, what is the connection? Well, let's see. The Passover commemorates the salvation of the Israelites on the night of the last of the plagues that Moses placed upon the house of Egypt. That plague was targeted to the firstborn sons, primarily to the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, and it would result in their deaths. But the plague would hit everybody. So Moses instructed the Israelites to make a sacrifice of an early spring lamb and then take the blood of that lamb and spread it upon the lintels and doorposts of the houses so that the destroying angel would pass over their homes and leave their firstborn sons alive. The record in the book of Exodus says this is exactly what happened, and the Israelite children were saved, and the Passover rites have been observed ever since. That President Russell M. Nelson called for a fast on the first day of Passover is, I think, not a coincidence. You see, he called for us to sacrifice and to fast. He promised us that the Lord would hear our prayers and the plague that consumes the whole world would be abated. In a very real way, this is almost exactly like the Mosaic ritual observed by the ancient Israelites. I guess you could reasonably say that for the first time in history, the church observed the Passover. You see, rituals and rites can be observed in various ways depending upon the circumstances of the people involved, as long as the principle behind the observation is respected. In times of distress or war, famine or pestilence, normal religious observations may not always be able to be conducted in the designated places and by the designated methods and officials. Remember, during the coronavirus quarantine, we were unable to attend church, but could still study and hold our own private discussions, classes, if you will. We were authorized to prepare and bless the sacrament in our own homes. Now you may ask, what does this have to do with the Book of Mormon? Well, a couple of things. I want you to remember that 1, some rites can be flexible as to the schedule or setting of their observance, and 2, though he translated the record, Joseph Smith could not have been expected to understand some of the actions he was writing about. Now, after that very long introduction, let's see what obscure rite we might have missed early in 1 Nephi. In 600 BC, the turmoil was intense in Jerusalem and the lands round about. There was political intrigue in every corner. The Babylonians were once more at the gate, and the prophet Jeremiah, who had been a counselor to Zedekiah, was now preaching against the king, and that was a very dangerous thing to do. We know it was early in the year because Nephi says in the 4th verse of the book, "And it came to pass in the commencement of the first year of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah." So we are talking very possibly sometime near the Passover. Now, we don't know how long Lehi endured the difficulties of that day. We are told that many prophets came that same year to prophesy. In this setting, Lehi set to praying and was soon given in visions to see the great and terrible things which were set to befall Jerusalem. After he had had his profound visions, he gave up his commercial endeavors and began prophesying in and around Jerusalem. The scripture says, "After the Lord had shown so many marvelous things unto my father Lehi, yea, concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, behold, he went forth among the people and began to prophesy and to declare unto them concerning the things which he had both seen and heard." We are not told how long he prophesied in and around Jerusalem, but we must assume that it was some amount of time enough at least for people to become aware of him and to become angry with him, enough so as to put him and his family into serious danger. In 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 20, we read, "And when the Jews heard these things, they were angry with him, yea, even as with the prophets of old, whom they had cast out and stoned and slain. And they also sought his life, that they might take it away." The dangers became so real that Lehi was commanded to leave. So read in 1 Nephi 2, verse 4, he departed into the wilderness, and he left his house, and the land of his inheritance, and his gold, and his silver, and his precious things, and took nothing with him, save it were his family, and provisions, and tents, and departed into the wilderness. This was not done lightly. Later we read that murmuring started almost immediately, especially for the two older boys, Laman and Lemuel, but eventually even his wife Sariah murmured. Nevertheless, the family followed him, and we read in 1 Nephi 2, verses 5 and 6, that, quote, he came down by the borders near the Red Sea, and he traveled in the wilderness in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea. And he did travel in the wilderness with his family, which consisted of my mother Sariah and my elder brothers who were Laman, Lemuel, and Sam. And it came to pass that when he had traveled 3 days in the wilderness, he pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river of water. In my previous podcast, Lehi in the Desert, we discussed the significance of the odd terminology, river of water. This particular phrase stirred much derision in Joseph Smith's day, but with the subsequent discoveries of the last 190 years, he has been thoroughly vindicated in this usage. It is an interesting item, but let's move on. Now we are getting to the meat of today's exploration. Verse 7 says, and it came to pass that he built an altar of stones, and made an offering unto the Lord, and gave thanks unto the Lord our God. And then it says something very strange. It says, and my father dwelt in a tent. What an odd thing to say. I mean, of course he dwelt in a tent. Everybody dwelt in a tent for the whole journey. They certainly hadn't taken the time to build a permanent dwelling. This is such a short verse, and it seems so insignificant and unnecessary. And yet, for some reason, it was important enough for Nephi to make the effort to inscribe it on the plates, and important enough for Mormon to include it in his abridgment. So I am forced to ask, why? Why would Mormon, 1,000 years later, say to himself, yeah, this needs to go in there? Remember, Mormon was only able to include 100th part of all the records he had been entrusted with. So what makes the fact that Lehi dwelt in a tent worth more than 100 other things also written on the original records? This is really the only time in the record that specifically addresses the dwelling in which they live. And why would Nephi have to make a point of saying this at all? After all, at the beginning of the chapter, as we read a moment ago, let me read it again to you. He left his home and the land of his inheritance and his gold and his silver and his precious things, and took nothing with him, save it were his family and provision and tents, and departed into the wilderness. So, that having been said, why point out here that his father dwelt in a tent? And for that matter, why say specifically, my father dwelt in a tent? Are we to believe that Nephi and his brothers and his mother and his sisters slept outside? Or that they had only one tent? This is one of those subtle details that are so easy to pass by, that are found throughout the Book of Mormon. They are often hard to spot, but they demonstrate why one must search the scriptures and not just read them as quickly as possible. So again, why is this verse in the record? Let's find out. I want to tell you about another Jewish rite. This one is much less known outside of the Jewish community. It's called Sukkot, and the common spelling is Sukkot, although it's spelled a number of different ways. Let me describe it for you. Sukkot is traditionally described as the Feast of the Tabernacles and is observed sometime between September and October. During the existence of the temple in Jerusalem, it was considered one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals for which the Israelites were commanded to perform a pilgrimage to the temple. It comes 5 days after Yom Kippur and lasts normally 5 days. It celebrates the gathering of the harvest and commemorates the miraculous protection that God provided for the children of Israel when they had left Egypt. More important to our discussion here today is how it is now traditionally observed. The observer constructs a sukkah, which is, by design, a very flimsy structure of at least 3 walls and a covering of natural vegetation. An alternate way to build it is to build a tent-like structure of minimal construction. Now, this flimsy or minimalist construction is by design and is to remind the participant of the humility and the minimal possessions of the children of Israel as they wandered through the Egyptian desert. I had never heard of this observance, but as I was preparing this podcast, I happened to mention this to my oldest son. He immediately said, "Oh yeah, Sukkot. My boss just got through observing that last week." I was shocked. Then, a few days later, I wanted to tell my best friend how shocked I was that my son knew about Sukkot, and he said, "Yeah, I know all about Sukkot. My neighbor was a very strict Jew, and I helped him build his tent in his backyard." I don't know where I was, but my whole life I had never heard of this. It turns out that all around the world, observant Jews leave their homes for 1 week a year and live in a flimsy shelter in the backyard. Important to this is that at very least they must eat their meals in the sukkah and should not eat anything outside of the sukkah. In a book called Gathered in One, How the Book of Mormon Counters Anti-Semitism in the New Testament, author Bradley J. Kramer says the following: "Such an emphasis on Lehi's tent may mystify some readers. However, to anyone steeped in Jewish tradition, this emphasis resonates remarkably with Sukkot, especially given the Mosaic events that preceded it. Sukkot, after all, occurs 5 days after Yom Kippur, and dwelling in temporary shelters, such as tents, is central to how it is celebrated." He continues, "As Rabbi Donan explains, the name Sukkot refers to the tempting places used by the children of Israel in the desert during the 40-year period of wandering following the Exodus from Egypt. During this festival, traditionally observant Jews construct makeshift huts or booths and live in them for a week. Not only are the repeated references to Lehi's tent consistent with Sukkot, but Lehi's actions while dwelling within his tent are also consonant with one of the central purposes of this festival, to reenact Israel's wandering in the wilderness. Here, much like Moses in that wilderness, Lehi gives thanks to God for his family's deliverance, blesses his children, speaks to them with power, and reviews the history of how the ancient children of Israel were also led out of captivity. Indeed, Lehi fills the role of Moses so well that he almost seems like a reincarnation of Judaism's ancient lawgiver. And then there's more. He goes on. He says, like Moses, Lehi is well acquainted with the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptian. Like Moses, he foretells woes that will come upon his Egypt-favoring people and is mocked by them for doing so. Like Moses, he is led, as it were, by a pillar of fire out of a wicked land, where his life too was threatened, and takes his people 3 days into the wilderness. And finally, like Moses, when he escaped to safety in the wilderness, he built an altar of stone and made an offering unto the Lord and gave thanks. And then this from the Shabbat.org website. A few important points about Sukkot here. Of all the Jewish holidays, Sukkot is the only one whose date does not seem to commemorate a specific historic event. Now, in Lehi's case, it was not a general historic event, but rather a life-changing event for him and his family. Absolutely the proper time to remember Sukkot. How appropriate for Lehi to remember this observance as he and his family make their way out of the land of Jerusalem, a part of Egypt. I cannot think of a more fitting rite to follow, nor a better time for its observance. Kramer posted an excerpt of his book in the Meridian magazine. He titled it, "The Jewish Holiday You Didn't Notice," in the opening chapters of the Book of Mormon. And then he said this, "What I love about this is twofold. First, it gives reason for Nephi to make a specific point about his father dwelling in a tent. And second, it is an obscure observance about which there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to assume that Joseph Smith could have or did know anything about this." And when you think about it, if Joseph Smith had somehow learned of this observance, and if he had fabricated this story as a fraud, he most likely would have made a point of pointing out how faithfully Lehi took the time to observe this ancient Jewish festival. That Joseph didn't know about this is evidenced by the fact that he does not mention either of the two other pilgrimage festivals anywhere else in this record. I would challenge the skeptics to explain to me how that could happen. Go back, read the first few chapters of 1 Nephi again, slowly. Consider all of the words and what they say. As you do, think about the fact that every time Joseph introduced a specific detail, such as a river of water, or that there was a deep and steadfast valley next to the river of water, just 3 days' journey from Jerusalem, realize that he was opening himself up to scrutiny and criticism, which in fact did happen. In Joseph's day, he had not the ammunition to fend off these criticisms, only the sure knowledge that he had not made this up. He had been true and faithful to the translation as it was given to him, and he stood by that work. Today, we have the luxury and advantage of having almost 200 years of scientific research, which has uncovered knowledge and information, all of which perfectly supports the early pages of 1 Nephi. Study these things. Ponder them in your heart. Then apply Moroni's promise as found in Moroni 10, the last pages of the Book of Mormon, and pray about them. I promise you that the Holy Ghost will manifest the truthfulness of these things to you, and your testimony will be strengthened. Please understand that I am not trying to intellectually convince you that this Book of Mormon is true. We all know that a testimony of the Book of Mormon is to be borne to your heart by the Holy Ghost. But having said that, we are constantly admonished to strengthen our testimonies through study and prayer and meditation. Well, this is the study part. This is the part that you can go home and meditate on after you've listened to these little bits. Meditate on and ponder, how could Joseph Smith have included these things in his record without any knowledge of them? Faith in the Book of Mormon is the keystone of our religion. It is the cornerstone of our religion. And when all else fails, when you're mad at your bishop or at the church or for some reason offended by whomever or whatever it is, and you think you just can't maintain your testimony any longer, I want you to have a testimony of the Book of Mormon strong enough that you cannot turn away. The Book of Mormon is true. It is real. I bear you my testimony that the Book of Mormon is true and authentic. And I pray and hope that you will gain or strengthen a testimony of the same thing in your life. Until next time, I'm Mark Swint. Thank you for listening.